Hello, everyone. It's the Halloween season, and I've talked about Halloween several times. I've talked about monsters several times, and so I was wondering what I could talk about this year. And I figured I could connect this with a surprise that we're going to tell everyone is that on October 31st, on the day of Halloween, we are going to launch a new fairy tale, Little Red Riding Hood. And so we decided to launch it on Halloween because there is a very strange connection between Little Red Riding Hood and Halloween. And so I thought that would be a good subject for the video today. This is Jonathan Pedro. Welcome to the Symbolic World. We have been teasing it for a while, but now is the official announcements. We are publishing a version of Little Red Riding Hood, Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf, written by me, of course, and illustrated beautifully by Chris Weaver. It is a very important tale to tell right now and deals with a lot of the issues that we're seeing in our culture. And so we've also added the symbolism of in the book. So the fairy tale and the symbolism of is contained in the same book. We're starting the pre-orders today on Halloween, and all people that pre-order it will get an audiobook version of the book that I have recorded myself. And the first 1,000 people to order the book will be invited to a special Q&A, which we will discuss and have fun and talk about all of the questions surrounding Little Red Riding Hood and whatever else you want to talk about. And so go to store.thesymbolicworld.com and order your book today. One of the things that characterizes Halloween, of course, is the trick-or-treating. This is the aspect that we have preserved the most, that we know the most. And so in trick-or-treating, what you have is someone who comes in a disguise to your house to ask for a treat, to ask for something to eat. And if you don't give them something to eat, then you get a trick. And so in some ways, you have to propitiate the monster, right? It really is, as I've mentioned in my other videos, it is a little moment where you kind of understand the problem or the issue of when these little monsters come to you. And so if you give them a little something to eat, then they go away. They will come back, but they will go away for a little while. Now, what is the connection between Little Red Riding Hood? Now, of course, you probably guessed it already as I'm telling you what Halloween is about, but what is the difference between it? So, of course, in the story of Little Red Riding Hood, you have a monster, you have a wolf, you have something that will devour you, right? And that is very important to understand in some ways what a monster is, especially in the case of Halloween. It is something that comes from death. It is something that is there to hurt you, to destroy you, a vampire, a werewolf, all these different things. And so this monster comes to the house of the grandmother. And so now the sequence of the events is different from Halloween. But this is, of course, how symbolism works. Once you kind of understand, you can notice that you have to be able to lay out the land and understand things, how they relate to each other. And sometimes the sequence of the way they come together is not the same, but it will still point to the same kind of symbolism. And so the wolf comes to the house of the grandmother in a disguise. He pretends to be Little Red Riding Hood. And so you have already a kind of opposite of what happens at Halloween. In Halloween, you have little children that are innocent that come dressed as monsters. So you have this kind of strange situation where in some ways it is the opposite of Halloween. In the story of Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf plays the trick at the outset. And so asks the grandmother, if he can come in as Little Red Riding Hood. And once the grandmother lets the wolf in, then he eats the grandmother. And so you can see that the elements are kind of all there, but they're not in the same order. Of course, in Halloween, it is children dressed as monsters. They come to the house and they ask for a treat. And if they don't, then they trick you. Here, the wolf comes to the house dressed as a little girl, doesn't ask for a treat, tricks you, and then eats you. All right. And so what's important to understand is to really kind of understand it as a basic structure. The best way often to think about this in terms of space. So you have your home, you have your house, and your house is the place where you are safe. It's the place where you find your identity. It's the place where you find your origin. And then on the outside of that house are strangers. There are different levels of strangers, of course. There are your neighbors, and those neighbors usually are not dangerous. But then there are strangers that are farther away from you that you don't know what their intentions are. And then there are strangers that are in some ways so far from you that they don't have your good in mind, right? Because they don't identify with you. And for that reason, they don't feel like they necessarily have your good in mind. And therefore, this is, of course, what a war is. A war is strangers that don't have your good in mind, that are willing to put your good to the service of theirs, right? And that is, of course, the danger with strangers, is that sometimes strangers, because they're not aligned with our purposes, we don't know what they want, we don't know what their allegiance is to, and of course sometimes this can turn into danger, right? That's why you tell children don't talk to strangers. Of course, we used to tell children don't talk to strangers, not because strangers are immediately bad, but because strangers are unknown, and because we don't know what their allegiance is, and we don't know what good they're pursuing. And so you have this stranger that is on the outside, and the stranger, or the strange, right, can be represented, of course, as a predator if the strange is there to, it doesn't have your good in mind. If, like in a war, the stranger sees you as food for them, they want to take your land, take your, make you a vassal state or whatever that is. And in that sense, they see you as food for their sake. And then there's also this sense that they're a monster. That is, they are unknown. They are mixture. They're chaos. And in the story of Little Red Riding Hood, we often don't realize that the wolf, of course, the talking wolf, is already in that world. That is, a talking wolf is something like, the speaking serpent in the garden. It's not a usual animal. It is in some ways an animal that is replying, right? It is an animal that is not, let's say, subdued by the human, but is rather speaking back, you could say, and answering, or trying to impose their meaning on you. And that in some ways is what it means for a monster to eat you, right? Is that in general, animals are subdued to us. That is, we rule over the animals, but once in a while, the animals come and they can devour us, the wild animals. And then you can represent that, of course, as a monster. You can represent it as a speaking wolf or a speaking serpent that wants to impose their rule on you. And so you can see that this is what's happening in Little Red Riding Hood. And in Halloween, you also have the same structure. That is, on the night of Halloween, we kind of put on a little play or a little game where we experiment the question of monsters and the questions of the strange, the question of that which is dead to us, which comes out and now roams the streets and comes up to our house and knocks on the door. And so when they knock on the door, they are in some ways coming to your identity and asking to be let in, you could say. Now, when you deal with something that is from the outside, you also have to be careful to realize to what extent do you let it in, and this is, of course, something that you do every time. If a mailman comes to your house, you won't let them into your bedroom. You might maybe let them into the entrance door, to get the letter or whatever. If a salesman comes to your house, you won't completely let them in. But if your friend comes, you let them in, right? We've talked about this several times on this channel before. And the stranger or the monster then appears as this unknown thing that might want to hurt you. And of course, in the case of Halloween, what you do is you give them a little something so that they don't eat you, right? You could say, so that they don't trick you, so that they don't eat you. It is really a version of propitiation. And as I've said on several occasions, of course, we think that that's weird. It's kind of pagan, and maybe in some ways it is, but we have to understand that doing it as a game is a way to understand that we do it all the time, right? Where we propitiate things that are outside from us. We propitiate, let's say, our desires that are there to that are trying to devour us, we'll give them a little something in order to keep them calm for a while. And this is, of course, what we do, right, all the time. So, you can see this happening in some ways right now in North America, where, let's say, you could say, in order to keep people calm, for a very long time, how can I explain this? In order to keep people calm, or in order to keep people from kind of bubbling up, then in certain states, for example, California, they've made shoplifting legal, or not legal. They at least decided not to prosecute it up to a certain amount of money. And that is in some ways a way to propitiate, right? It is in some ways you have these people that are hungry, you could say, and that are threatening, and you give them a little something so that they go away. They go away for a while. But then, of course, like I said, the problem is that they come back. Now, this is in some ways neither positive nor negative. When someone, let's say a homeless person, comes up to you and asks you for money, in some ways that's what you're doing. You have someone who's strange, whose intentions you don't know, someone who is roaming, right? They could say like the roaming spirits on Halloween, and that person asks you for something, and you give them something in order to of course help them, but also in some ways to keep them calm, right? Just so that they don't like lose control and start to rob people, because if they receive a little bit of something continuously, in some ways it can maintain their peacefulness, you could say, in the world. And so, like I said, it's not really a moral question most of the time. Sometimes it can be a moral question, but in the case of Little Red Riding Hood, then you can really see the structure play out really in the sense of you have a strange monster that is pretending to be something that it is not, right? It is a wolf man dressed as a little girl, or parading as a little girl, in order to come in and eat the grandmother, and then parading as the grandmother in order to eat Little Red Riding Hood, et cetera, et cetera. So you can kind of see a good example of what happens if you're not careful of what it is that you let in to the house, and why we say that you have to, you tell your children to be careful around people whose intentions you don't know, to be careful around strangers. And so in our version of Little Red Riding Hood, we in some ways are really, you could say, hitting the nail right now, because it feels like some of these questions of a hybrid, creature that wears women's clothing, you could say, that, is impersonating a grandmother in order to eat your children. It seems strangely relevant or at least has been strangely relevant in the last few years. So we thought it'd be important to, publish a version of that story in order to help our children to know that, to be able to distinguish, or to be able to recognize the wolves that are dressed in your grandmother's clothing, so that they don't get devoured. So in our version of the book, what we've done is, of course, I've added some sections. I think you will enjoy them. I've made the story a little longer. I've added a whole extra little bit at the end, which I think kind of helps you understand what the story is about. And in this particular version, we've also put the symbolism of Little Red Riding Hood at the end of the book. And so in one volume, you get the beautifully illustrated fairy tale by Chris Weaver. And at the end, you also get a kind of symbolism of Little Red Riding Hood. So one of the aspects of Halloween that makes it so relevant is that in some ways it is the moment, you could say, where we start to notice, of course, that the days are getting shorter, right? That the sun is going away. And so there is a relationship between the Feast of the Dead, between the idea of death and the sun getting lower in the sky, the days getting shorter, moving towards the solstice. Now, symbolism, the way it crosses over, and these are techniques that can help you kind of interpret stories, is that there's a relationship, of course, between the idea that this happened, that the monster comes out and, comes out when the day is getting shorter, right? With the idea of the midnight hour, right? In the darkness, this is where the monster kind of comes out. And in Little Red Riding Hood, the idea of going off the path. Now, going off the path can be understood. You can imagine the sun has a path, and then the sun is kind of disappearing into the darkness, right? Is disappearing in the sky, and going into the forest is related, of course, to night, and it is related to the idea of losing your way. If you lose your way when it's dark, things are not clear, and there is a kind of ominous sense of not being in the place of life, you could say, right? And that is, of course, what happens when the sun goes down, especially in the lands where Halloween would have been developed, in the lands where we have fall and we have winter, and we watch things die, and we notice that the days are getting shorter, the world is getting colder, and there is death that is happening. And that is, of course, connected to Little Red Riding Hood, because when she moves off the path, one of the things she's doing is that she's moving away from her identity. Now, this is harder to understand, but if you meditate on the story of Little Red Riding Hood, you will understand that one of the main issues of Little Red Riding Hood is about the idea of maintaining lineage, right? And so what you have is you have a mother, and you have this young girl who is usually 12 years old, who's usually right at the moment of puberty. And this young girl at the moment of puberty is sent to her grandmother's house, right? And so the mother gives her food and then sends her alone to her grandmother's house. So what you have in the case of Little Red Riding Hood is a young woman, a young girl, who is in between, right? Is in between stages and is on the verge of kind of becoming a mother herself, or becoming a wife herself. And so there is a sense in which this connection in the woods, you could say, of a path that connects the grandmother with the mother, and then ultimately to her, is an image of identity and an image of lineage. And so and of course, in the story, it's very particular because, her mother gives her a purpose, right? And the purpose is to serve her grandmother, right? So in some ways, that's why it's so connected to identity. It's like, here's your lineage, and now you will bring food to your lineage so you can maintain your lineage by helping your grandmother survive, but also by following the purpose that I'm giving you. So you can see in the story how purpose and lineage are connected. And so when Little Red Riding Hood leaves the path, she is, of course, going out into darkness. She is forgetting her purpose. She's forgetting the reason why she's on the path bringing food to her mother. She gets distracted, you could say, by the things on the edge of the path and the things that could tempt her. And, of course, that is when she encounters the wolf. Now, of course, in this particular story, in the story of Little Red Riding Hood, there is also a kind of sexual element, you could say, related to this, because of course Little Red Riding Hood is reaching puberty, and so that is the moment when she will, of course, become someone who can perpetuate the lineage of her family, perpetuate the lineage of her grandmother and her mother. And so you can kind of understand that transition between these two places also as, the transition of her becoming a woman. Now, in that transition, there are all kinds of dangers, right? She can get distracted. She can become the prey of a predator, the prey of a sexual predator, the prey of someone who would trick her into all kinds of things, and that would devour her lineage. Now, this is, sometimes people think that this is weird, but they're literally in some versions of the early Little Red Riding Hood where the wolf, when Little Red Riding Hood arrives in the house of the grandmother and discovers her grandmother that has been replaced by the wolf will offer her food, which turns out to be, of course, her grandmother, right? So you can see that in the whole thrust of the story, there's this whole idea of this notion of destroying your lineage by something like cannibalism, which I've talked about before. Cannibalism is, of course, a breakdown in normal causality, right? Where you devour your elder, right? And so you are made out of your elder, right? So your elder makes you, and then you eat them, and so you kind of you kill your own parents, but you also devour them, and so all causality kind of breaks down. There's no, it's like, who are you at that point? If you eat their body and it becomes your body, everything becomes confused. So cannibalism is often an image of that type of transgression. But of course, the transgression is there, also in the way in which Little Red Riding Hood is the prey of all kinds of predators that would prevent her from participating properly in the lineage, right? Becoming a mother, becoming a grandmother, etc., etc. And so, like the person that goes through puberty, and it's a kind of transition from one state to the other, it is represented as a little dying, right? Of course, that little dying can be represented in all kinds of ways in terms of the beginning of the menstrual cycle. All of these images in fairy tales they're kind of there floating around. You see that, of course, in the story of Jairus' daughter, which is this 12-year-old girl that dies. The relationship between the issue of blood, all of this is integrated, of course, in this story. So you can understand, and this is going to be a bit of a stretch for all of you. Hopefully you can understand. You can also understand that when the sun goes down into the sky, right, when the days become darker and darker, there is less fertility in the land, right? So the land will not produce fruit. And so that transition is also related, you could say, to the fallow part of the fertility cycle, the normal fertility cycle of a human. So there's a connection between the idea of this aspect, right? A notion of death and of transition, and also of, you could say, missed humans, right? Or the idea of a residue, right? So the monsters, they are in some ways residues. There's a connection, of course, between the idea of not incompletely formed children and monsters. If you know a little bit about stillbirth, and you know a little bit about what happens sometimes, that many of the legendary monsters seem to have a connection, at least in terms of phenomenology, with the way that people saw stillbirth, and how certain stillbirths would have characteristics that would be similar to monstrosity. And so this idea of a failure of fertility is, of course, there in the notion of the moment of Halloween, when the monsters come out, right? And then everything is kind of upside down. Instead of the sun acting on the world and causing things to grow, now it's death that's coming out, and it looks like death is going to eat the cycle. It looks like darkness is going to take over. Of course, because we know the story, we know that it will return, that fertility will return, and that the sun will also return. But this is all related to the symbolism, of course, of Little Red Riding Hood, but also the symbolism of Halloween. And so a lot to think about. I hope that this makes sense to you. This in some ways is a little more esoteric than what I usually talk about, but a lot of this symbolism is going to be there in the symbolism of Little Red Riding Hood book that is accompanying the fairy tales. So thanks everyone for your attention, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.